Ben Thompson is presenting on Moses Amyraut and on the communication of divine goodness to humanity. So Ben completed the MA Theology program in the summer of 2025 as well. He lives in Antrim with his wife Ruth and their two daughters Clara and Sophia. He is currently engaged in freelance translation work, having previously studied modern languages at university. He's currently pursuing options for further PhD study. He has been involved in a range of capacities in various church contexts, including public speaking and leading small groups. Welcome, Ben.
Good morning. It's good to be with you today and to have this opportunity to discuss some of the work of the early modern French Reformed theologian Moses Amyraut. So thank you very much for this invitation. I'm not sure how familiar the name Amyraut will be to everybody here. He was a 17th-century theologian who lived within the Protestant minority in France at that time under the temporary religious tolerance brought about by the Edict of Nantes in 1598. Amyraut was born in 1596 and he died in 1664. He was a leading teacher at the Academy of Saumur in France, one of the main centres of Reformed thought there at the time. And he had a significant influence on many of his students. He shaped the theology of following generations. If you have heard of him, you've probably heard of him in connection with some debates about predestination and election, where he's sometimes associated with a view referred to as hypothetical universalism. Now, I will touch on this theme a little bit more below, but one of the contentions of my own work on Amyraut is that this association has perhaps led to an imbalance in the scholarship on his work. So partly to rectify some of this imbalance, in this project I sought to examine both Amyraut's theology and his broader political thought, as seen in two of his key works, firstly his Brief Treatise on Predestination, and secondly his Apology for Those of the Religion. Through an examination of these works, I argue in this piece that for this theologian, God's purpose for creation as a whole is the pursuit of his glory through the communication of divine goodness to creatures in a knowable way, which leads to human participation in God's own happiness and holiness. This premise then leads to a positive articulation of how Christianity can function for the good and happiness of a society, even as a religious minority. In order to demonstrate this point, we will look firstly at Amyraut's theology, specifically his soteriology, as reflected in his Brief Treatise on Predestination, which, as I noted, is probably the most familiar of his works. At the beginning of this work, Amyraut deals with predestination in a very holistic way. He says that this denotes the entirety of God's dealings with rational creatures, intelligent human beings, in creating them and directing them toward a specific end. And so as he considers predestination in this way, a key point of focus for Amyraut is that all of creation is aimed at God's glory, but this glory is never seen as something which creates a kind of competition between God and man. Instead, God seeks his own glory specifically through the creation of human beings who are, in their character, beautiful and praiseworthy. So Amyraut highlights God's goodness as the central aspect of his being, which is communicated in the creation. He freely gives good things to creatures above and beyond the necessities of life. For Amyraut, he puts it this way: chief among God's virtues which are shown in the creation of the world is his goodness, for as the prophet says, the Eternal One is good to all, and his compassions are over all his works. Human beings are then seen as participating in God's goodness in a special way by possessing intelligence and reason, which are qualities which function to lead them to both happiness and holiness. God creates human beings mainly to display his own glory by communicating the divine qualities of moral goodness and happiness to his creatures such that they possess these qualities. An important point to note here is that for Amyraut, God's goodness is always communicated in a way that humans by nature are able to perceive as laudable and beautiful. So there's a really strong knowability to the account of God's goodness that he gives. And the pursuit of these things in creation is the heart of predestination for Amyraut. The scholarship on Amyraut has, however, highlighted tensions in this presentation of things. His strong emphasis on the communication of divine goodness in creation raises the question of why the fall ever occurred and why these things were distorted. It could be argued that Amyraut never fully resolves this tension. He raises and discards several possible reasons for this, before ultimately concluding that the decline of man brought about by the fall opened up a new possibility of his elevation to a kind of supernatural salvation, where only natural goodness would have been possible otherwise. But within this part of his argument, Amyraut does provide a key insight into his own thought when he writes as follows. He is truly God in that he is good, but he is also God in that he is infinitely elevated above his creatures and is obligated to none in any way. And having made this claim, Amyraut is then able to continue to emphasize the divine freedom through the rest of his treatise. Such a claim is certainly not foreign to orthodoxy, but we are left with the tension of how this freedom relates to the aforementioned ubiquity and knowability of God's goodness. Tension is again present in Amyraut's account of the access humanity has to the salvation God offers. One of the major points of controversy arising from Amyraut's work on predestination was his claim that it was at least hypothetically possible for mankind to attain to salvation without explicit knowledge of Christ or his word. Amyraut seems to argue quite extensively in favor of this point. He wants to oppose the notion that God's dealings with humans are completely arbitrary. But even in this section, he clarifies that this kind of faith, without knowledge of Christ, remains a purely hypothetical reality, since man in his fallen condition is characterized by a kind of blindness and obstinacy which can only be overcome by hearing and responding to the gospel message. And this is a point that he came to emphasize later when his teaching was challenged. As such, Amyraut has sought to argue that God is universally good and that he is free to deny salvation to some without injustice on his part. Perhaps the fundamental tension at play in Amyraut's thought here is between his commitment to the Orthodox Reformed tradition and his desire to argue for a fully knowable account of God's goodness and benevolence toward creation as a whole. So this tension may lie in the intent of Amyraut's argument, what he sets out to prove, and the parameters within which he does this, namely the required content of his religious belief. So having discussed Amyraut's soteriology, we can now move to think about his political thought. He lived within the specific political climate defined by the terms of the Edict of Nantes in 1598, where French Protestants were granted freedom of worship and practice on certain conditions. This background plays a central role in the second work of his that I looked at in this project, his Apology for Those of the Religion, by which he was referring to the Protestant Christians. This work includes an extensive recounting of recent French religious history. He praises the government of France for the rights they grant to Protestants, though he does add that these aren't always followed. Ultimately, Amyraut argues for a degree of religious pluralism in society by presenting civil structures and not religious institutions as the main means whereby God's goodness is mediated to societies. Part of the context to which Amyraut is responding to in this work is the extended recent conflict over religion in France, where both Protestant and Catholic Christians had sought to make their beliefs the officially recognized religion of the country, often in violent ways. Amyraut expresses lament over this past violence. He writes that it would be far more consistent with the nature of the gospel and the practice of the ancient church to meet persecution with no other weapons than patience, tears, and prayers, and to wait upon God to change the hearts of kings such that they would grant rest and freedom to their subjects. The argument for non-violence is a central part of his apology and may also represent a practical necessity given the fact that French Protestantism at this point relies on a degree of government approval in order to survive. So his approach may be pragmatic, but he does offer a striking contrast to some earlier French Protestants and indeed to John Calvin himself, whom he very much admired, but who often spoke in highly polemical criticism of political leaders. By contrast, Amyraut argues extensively for a separation between political and religious power. This separation allows him to argue for personal religious freedom without arguing that those beliefs should be imposed on the population at large. Amyraut does see it as appropriate for kings and rulers to advocate for the belief they hold, but this must be done with gentleness and reason, and not, in his words, through iron and fire. The primary glory of kings is located for Amyraut in the peace and stability of their nations. Royal power comes directly from God, outside of any ecclesial approval, which means that Protestantism in itself is not a threat to the validity of the king's rule, as it would be if he were required to impose Catholic belief on his subjects, as indeed some writers at the time argued. For individual citizens, Amyraut argues that far from seeking the overthrow of governments that do not officially support their religious convictions, they should see the monarchy as God's providential means of governing society. In Amyraut's words, God shines a ray of his majesty through the glory and authority of monarchs. He seeks to elevate the rights and duties of kings, while emphasizing that they too will face divine judgment based on their manner of rule. The individual Christian, however, is not bound to a kind of absolute obedience to royal decrees. Where these contravene Christian belief and practice, they are to be disregarded, and any consequences are to be borne with patience. Part of Amyraut's argument for the toleration of Protestant Christians at this time rests on their widespread presence in French society and the contributions they make. Against the polemical claim that Protestants do not care about good works, Amyraut affirms that they are to do good primarily because such deeds are in themselves excellent and praiseworthy. Good actions are also essential to the pursuit of human happiness. In a manner that echoes his arguments about the end of humanity being to witness to the divine goodness, Amyraut argues that the end of the salvation of individual Christians is that they would come to participate in God's own goodness and holiness, such that God delights in them. As such, Christians can connect their predestination to their actions in society. Just as God created them to participate in his happiness and holiness, so they can enact this communication of divine goodness by participating in good works in their own contexts. As we saw beforehand, Amyraut's thought is not without tension. And the same pattern continues here. One such example would be that while he argues for a kind of ecclesial independence from political authorities, he also calls upon those authorities to convene synods, which were central to the government of the Reformed churches at that time. One scholar has even suggested that this inconsistency in Amyraut's thought on the relation between church and state later helped to open the door for a kind of enforced religious belief, which contributed to the conflict between faith and reason in the centuries that followed. Amyraut rejected this kind of conflict, but the tensions in his thought may again have contributed toward this problem. One aim of this project was to offer constructive engagement with the thought of Amyraut, and to this end, the premises outlined above can be helpful in seeking to build toward a specifically Amyraldian political theology. Such a theology would reflect a point that runs through both the works already examined above, as well as other works by Amyraut, namely the emphasis on natural morality. In Amyraut's thought, God is seen as gradually revealing his moral character through history. Special revelation does not replace, but rather builds upon the natural moral knowledge available to mankind. Amyraldian ethics aims at goals which are understood to flow from natural morality, aims which serve to demonstrate God's own goodness and help the development of society where peaceful religious coexistence is possible. So he doesn't see his moral aims as conflicting with Reformed theology as a whole. But the fact that these ends are not explicitly derived from Reformed premises may also be at the root of many of the tensions which can be seen in his work. Amyraut's work at times echoes contemporary rationalist thinkers such as Spinoza and Descartes, especially as he makes the connection between the benevolence of God and confidence in human rationality, a point which serves to support his reliance on natural moral knowledge. He further shares with Spinoza the emphasis on the universal benevolence of God, the focus on moral praxis rather than metaphysical speculation, and the pursuit of a good society characterized by freedom and human flourishing. As such, any specifically Amyraldian political theology would have to emphasize and build toward these goals. Amyraut gives humanity a very high status. They are seen as creatures endowed with reason who are created and redeemed by God in order for them to be made participants in God's own holiness and divinity. And this high view of humanity connects, for Amyraut, to what he sees as a distinctively human inclination to live in societies. This conception of humans is endowed with some level of natural and rational goodness, which creates a foundational bond between them, essential to Amyraut's argument for how Reformed Christianity can be seen as a positive force within society. It is in this vein that Amyraut provides a significant contribution to political theology, and that he offers a way for Christians to see themselves as a positive force for the good of the societies they inhabit, without seeking or expecting to be the largest or most influential religious group within that society. As noted above, this is a key implication of Amyraut's strong account of royal power as divorced from religious power. Human individuals and societies are natural goods which Christianity does not seek to do away with, but to reinforce and build upon. The purpose for which humans were made was to share in God's own holiness and happiness, and so it would not be difficult to claim that for Amyraut, Christianity is only fulfilling its own promise as it contributes to both the goodness and the happiness of the societies within which it exists, even as a religious minority. The peace and stability of societies is a good toward which one can cooperate alongside those who do not share the same beliefs. Every member of society is seen as having a stake in maintaining some level of peace and stability, since this is necessary for any kind of religious practice. This is also a theological point for Amyraut, since he argues that, in God's sight, caution and prudence are often more virtuous than religious zeal when it comes to the embodiment and dissemination of the teaching of the gospel. Amyraut's political thought thus prompts Christians to work for the good of the societies they inhabit, regardless of the sphere in which they do so, while also being willing to obey their conscience and accept the consequences of their actions. And all of this is ultimately grounded for Amyraut in the disposition of God toward humanity at large, a disposition which he sees Christians as being called to imitate. In the final pages of his apology, Amyraut explains that if French Reformed Christians are unable to procure fair treatment at the hands of their compatriots, then it is their responsibility to show true Christianity by meeting hostility with an indomitable patience. This is because, in his words, our good master commanded us to love our enemies, to bless those who curse us, to do good to those who hate us, and to pray for those who persecute us and pursue us. He says that in this way we will show that we are children of our Father who is in heaven, and that we will represent the image of this divine perfection of charity which he exemplifies for us. Amyraut thus appeals to the example of God the Father himself in showing patience, kindness, and generosity toward all, even those who actively oppose the Christian faith. This is how Christians are ultimately called upon to embody charity in all their dealings. In connection with Amyraut's broader political thought, this point provides the final theological justification for Christian behavior in society. Believers are to imitate and embody the disposition of the God they claim as Father by showing kindness and patience to all, even those who hate them. In doing so, Christians can seek the good of their societies, even from a position of smallness and weakness, a position very familiar to French Reformed Christianity in Amyraut's time. In conclusion, the two works by Moses Amyraut which I examined in this project collectively highlight his belief that the purpose of human creation is for God to pursue his own glory through the communication of his goodness to rational creatures in a knowable way. The pursuit of God's glory is closely connected to human participation in the divine moral virtues, and so any Amyraldian political theology must necessarily aim at the goodness and happiness of societies, seen as something to which Christians can contribute in any context. In spite of the tension in his work, Amyraut's thought does provide rich material for reflection, as one scholar has noted. His thinking is particularly significant in how it offers a way for Christians to contribute to the good and happiness of their societies as a religious minority, and to see this as part of God's larger plan in predestination. They are to seek the good of those around them and to respond in patient endurance when they face opposition, without taking things into their own hands in a violent way. Amyraldian thought thus provides avenues for fruitful reflection on Christian engagement in society, which must always ultimately be shaped by God's own disposition toward what he has made. He himself created the world to partake in his goodness and continues to communicate this goodness to society largely through civil structures. As such, Christians are to partner with him in this in such a way as to strengthen and build upon the natural goods present in the world as they seek to reflect the character of their Father in heaven. Thank you.